Okay, so thanks everyone for coming. This is the Planning for Megaregions class, Professor Ming Zhang's class. This is our final presentation. We have been working on this semester some projects related to our class trip earlier this semester. We went to Germany and the Netherlands, and we worked with local practitioners there and learned about different projects that they're working on the mega-regional scale. I'm pretty sure all of you are aware, but CM2 stands for Cooperative Mobility for Competitive Megaregions. And I'm both in the class and a GRA there, so that's why I'm helping moderate this final presentation. And before we kick things off, I just wanted to let Professor Zhang say a few words.
Okay, can you hear me now? Thank you all for attending this symposium. I called is an event sponsored by CM2, a student-led symposium. In this event, participants of the class, 10 participants of the class will present their studies of specific topics of their interest. So they travel to the Netherlands and Germany early in the spring, and learning from the local practitioners, professionals, and scholars, and trying to apply some lessons learned over there to Texas. So the topics they have chosen are, I encourage them, related to either their PR, their research projects currently working with professors, or if possible, linking to the real work, their office projects, others. So trying to link the classroom with the practice, the reality here. So this symposium featured with 10 presentations by them. So I'm very excited to see the outcome of those 10 projects done by the individual participants of the class. So this class is co-taught by Lisa Loftus-Ottaway of CTR, Center for Transportation Research, and myself. So with that brief introduction, I'll give the floor, give the screen to Lisa to see if she'd like to say a few words.
Just want to say good luck to everybody. And it's been a pleasure getting to know you in these crazy times.
And then we have also distributed the flyer to our CM2 partners at Penn and other universities. So there might be people kind of coming in and out during this event. So, okay, so back to you, Nadia.
Okay, I think we have Josiah's going first. So if you want to share your screen and let me know if you have any trouble with that.
Are we good?
Looks good.
Yes, awesome. Okay, so to kick off the symposium, I know that Ming gave a short introduction, but I just wanted to first start off and reiterate, I guess, something that I kept coming back to over the course of the last few months. And it was something I was struck by, certainly initially, was the prevalence of just regional identity that kind of underpinned each of the projects we were visiting. It seemed like just bam, like hit you with bags, brochures, signs, everything had logo, regional identity, reflecting what I saw kind of as a regional decision-making body, but also just a broader recognition of a collective effort everywhere from the citizen level all the way up to the EU. And it's, I think, really what made a lot of these projects that we were seeing possible. And when I started to reflect back to the Texas Triangle, I realized that one, the concept of a megaregion is kind of new. And two, even for those who are cognizant of the Texas Triangle as a megaregion, there's no real collective identity or larger scale collaboration. So what my research does is it looks at using content analysis approach to examine overlapping priorities for cities and MPOs within the Texas Triangle mega region. I'll kind of explain where that idea came from more. I think that one thing's obvious, and that's that the populations of both the major anchor cities in the Texas Triangle and the mid-level midway cities are going to continue seeing major population growth. With that, economies are going to continue to grow, and then resources and infrastructures will be strained as a result, as the region kind of fills in and the boundaries begin to blur. Moreover, we know that because of the agglomeration effect, that investments in one location are going to obviously flow into one another. But as things exist currently, there's really little coordinated efforts on infrastructure initiatives. And where it does happen, it's just usually a cooperation between 1 or 2 to 3 regions. And what I kind of started to find in my research was that it's not typically going to be the cities that are going to be working on these projects. And while they certainly could begin, the most logical actor in my mind was the MPOs. And this is because their work inherently, they work on work that inherently spans geographic boundaries. And they work with various levels of government. They work with cities, COGS, MPOs, and Department of Transportation. And much of their work revolves around regional connectivity, movement of goods and people. And these sort of things are things that already have and will continue to become mega regional issues. Now, there's been quite a bit of research regarding place branding and identities and the power of them to foster support and representation, as well as their overall effectiveness for governance. However, MPOs obviously aren't known for their strong identities, and even so, for the cities in the Texas Triangle, there's no real shared history, nothing recognized throughout. Rather, it's more of a geospatial relationship. So as a result, I tried to define similarities and differences in concerns, goals, and priorities of the 11 of 25 MPOs in the state of Texas that fall within the mega region, the Texas Triangle mega region, as noted in their regional transportation and metropolitan transportation plans. So that was really where I put my focus. From there, I looked for overlap that could be potentially exploited for initial smaller scale collaboration, with the hope that the trust building interdependence would eventually turn into broader mega regional cooperation as they solidify some form of identity. So each plan, of course, all RTPs and MTPs are required by federal law to address a certain criteria of issues. And you can see that here in this table with the FAST Act and the MAP 21. But at the same time, they each have their own autonomy to define their concerns, their goals, and their priorities. And I found that within that self-definition, we can see where potential for overlap exists. And so just from my research, I don't have time to cover it all, but some of the strongest similarities I started to see was in regional connectivity, frequently cited in their short list of goals, with smaller level MPOs aiming to improve the through traffic, while larger MPOs focus more on efficiently connecting the anchors, the major cities, with several of them noting rail as a potential. Obviously, issues like safety and security, which are required by federal law to address, but I think it has the potential to spark greater collaborative effort with data and information sharing, looking at sharing real-time crash information, road data, just one of those smaller scale things that already has infrastructure in place, but could be exploited on the mega regional level. And then finally, just a few more pieces: the economy, quality of life, equity and environmental justice, and the environment. They all made top 3 concerns for 1 to 2 of the MPOs, and each of which I think creates the potential for inter-regional, mega regional cooperation, as they inherently exist unbounded by geography, and they can be addressed on larger scales, and they're considered obviously byproducts of one another. So, of course, there are other concerns that I didn't have time to explore today, But between the clearly observed overlap of the concerns, goals, and priorities, and continued blurring of the regional borders as the center and the edges of the Texas Triangle megaregion continue to fill in. For example, I looked at the relationship between Austin and San Antonio MPOs, and they've been collaborating for quite some time. But a recent study specifically called for establishment of a regional identity, which I think shows progress that there is really an appetite for that. And so I think if the region's MPOs are able to direct planning efforts to the mega regional geographies, they'll be able to provide new insights and approaches to challenges beyond funding, including growth management, economic development, and environmental preservation. So with the added knowledge, I think from this research, member regions can begin to gain a little bit more clarity on the current conditions, and then hopefully begin interlocal collaboration on boundary spanning planning initiatives that really further the Texas Triangle as an economic powerhouse and a well-connected, cooperating mega region. So that is a brief overview of my research.
Thanks, Josiah. Just before Professor Zhang, did you want to do questions after every presentation or wait till the end?
I think we will have to wait to end it because our schedule is quite tight.
Okay, so I guess before we move on to Erasmo really quick, I just wanted to introduce our reviewers who are here. So we have Professor Jean-Claudia Schara here, Professor Michael Oden, and Professor Sandy Rosenblum, all of whom work with CM2 as researchers in mega-regional research. So thank you all for being here. Sorry I didn't introduce you in the beginning. We were a little rushed here starting things, but yeah, thanks for being here. And Erasmo, I'll let you take over now to share your screen. Let me know if you have any trouble. Erasmo, are you there? Might have some connectivity issues. Okay, Frank, are you able to go now? You'd be next on the list.
Oh, okay, yes, sure.
Great,
Okay.
Let me know if you have any trouble with screen sharing.
Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. My topic is about from commutes to mega-regional development in Texas. So the term of mega-region has been experiencing significant discussions over the decades in planning fields. And one question that what should constitute real evidence that mega-regions are coherent, powerful units of economic activity is kind of expected to be answered. And a well-known triangular mega-region exists in Texas Triangle, which has been predicted nearly 70% of the state's population in 2050 will be concentrated within this triangular mega-region. So unlike other identified mega-regions in the United States, the development of this triangular megalopolis is neither linear nor contiguous. So what makes this triangle a functional mega-region city? So this project comes into being with these questions and inspired by the observations of intercity travels from the Netherlands and Germany trip, and also considering the importance of commutes in structuring the geography of labor markets. My study employed the data sets of inter-county commuting flows in Texas as a proxy for patterns of economic interconnection to examine the trends of mega agglomeration in Texas, and also the existence of a large mega region in Texas. So the data sets come to 1990 decennial census intercounty commuting flows and ACA's 5-year intercounty commuting flows during 2011 to 2015. So for each period, I picked up all the flows with both its residence county and workplace county located in Texas. So in the study, 2 methods are developed. So first one is a visual interpretation by flow mappings, and the other relies on the algorithmic computation. The visualization of flow mapping helps with identifying the strongly interconnected county pairs and their patterns of spatial clustering visually. For algorithmic method, I want to introduce the notion of network analysis here. So by treating every county of Texas as a node or vertex, and any single flow as an edge connecting the nodes, the flow mapping of Texas kind of display a complex network structure. And a community in a network is a set of nodes in which the density of connections is much stronger internally with the community than it is externally with the members of different communities. And a community detection algorithm is applied here. The one I use is called Gervin-Newman algorithm. So such an algorithmic method can help provide a regionalization scheme, which can totally depends on the spatial laws, not just depends on the contestable human interpretation. So the result here. Okay. So the results from visual interpretation shows an obvious triangular spatial flow clustering starting from 1990 among 4 metro areas: Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and Austin. And even a clear triangular pattern with more strongly interconnected county pairs during 2011 to 2015. So figure 1 and figure 4 shows these patterns. And some statistics from the data sets kind of tell us for over half of the commuters are working in these large metros for both periods. And the most promising results come from the community detection algorithm. Because of that kind of time limitation, I'm unable to explain how this algorithm works, but surely is a method of divisive hierarchical clustering, which can use a term of modularity score to decide how many communities in this network is the best. As we can see here, in Texas network, the number of 35 communities reaches the highest modularity score, and community partitioning is shown as figure 7. So the same color means the same community. So by geographic blind algorithmic analysis of community structure in Texas, intercounty commuting data sets for large metropolitan areas, as I mentioned before, Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, and Austin, associated with other some small metro areas, are classified as one community, which kind of means that the economic interaction happening among these areas enables them to reach a kind of high level of agglomeration or integration, distinguish them from other parts of the Texas. So coming to the conclusion, a very clear-cut coherent spatial structure is exhibited by the geography of labor and the commuter interaction in Texas. A very obvious mega community exists as a dominant triangle form resulting from the spatial proximity of metro areas in this community. And it turns out that both methods developed here in my study can provide an expected similarity in terms of the economic geography of Texas, and finally confirm the assumed existence of a large macroregion in the Texas. So that's kind of a brief introduction for my project. That's it.
Thank you. I don't think Erasma's back, so I will go ahead and go next. So we kind of had the option to make, well, we made posters for the class, but I also chose to make a PowerPoint, just felt easier for me to present that way. So this is my PowerPoint on bicycle highway in the Texas Triangle megaregion. That photo on the right is from our trip earlier in the semester in Amsterdam when we all rode bikes around the city. So I started basically by looking at what is the definition of a bicycle highway, and they're defined by being these dedicated bicycle lanes that have regulations around the use and design, and they span over several miles connecting multiple cities. So I started by looking at the two case studies of the bicycle highways that we visited. So the first one is in the Randstad region of the Netherlands. It connects the cities of Nijmegen and Arnhem, which spans about 10 miles. The path has regulations around the signage, like the color, size, and type, and the lighting. And the project was funded almost entirely by municipalities and some by the province that they're in. And the total cost was about 16 million euros to build this project. The second case study that I looked at was the Velobahn, or the RS1, in the Rhine-Ruhr region of Germany. So this connects 10 cities over 62 miles, so quite a bit larger. And the bicycle highway regulates speed, lighting, and the maintenance of the track. So this project was funded mostly by the EU, but the rest was funded by the state and local governments, so none really came from the German federal government. And the project costs about $196 million to build, which comes to about 1.8 million euros per kilometer, as opposed to about 10 million euros per kilometer that it costs to build a kilometer of road for cars in Germany. So I took this information from the case studies and tried to apply it to the Texas Triangle region. First, what I did was I compared maps and data on density in the major metro regions in the Triangle, and took that information and concluded that one possible placement where there's already existing interest in cycling and already substantial population density is the Austin-San Antonio region. So the table to the right lists each city and the populations, and then like in the far right, their distance from one another. So the total population in the region is 2.7 million with a distance of about 90 miles. So before kind of going into how I determined the route for the specific project, I looked at the existing bicycle master plans in these cities. So it turns out that Austin and San Antonio have some pretty established bicycle master plans, and the city of San Marcos also has one, but it's very old and there hasn't been much follow-up on it. So the Austin plan lists its goals are to create a bicycle network that increases ridership, it's connected, it's safe, it's equitable. And the map on the left shows the places where the plan recommends creating this cycling track along TxDOT-owned roadways. So the project that I'm proposing would directly fulfill this requirement along I-35. And then the San Antonio plan states that its goal is to increase the number of bicycle commuters, and the map on the right shows a recent picture of the existing bicycle facilities in that city. So forgive me, since we aren't allowed on campus, I don't have access to GIS. So this is my really rough sketch map of the route. So it would start, like I said, in Austin, just north of the Colorado River, and run along the east side of 35 all the way down to San Antonio. And the only offshoot that I'm proposing is down right before San Antonio to the city of Schertz, which is about 3 miles from I-35 and has a sizable population. That would be worth the extra funding that it would cost to extend a little bit. And the path would end where I-35 and I-37 meet in San Antonio. So in the report, I proposed connection points where the bicycle path could offer an exit, or the bicycle highway could offer an exit, and riders could connect from the path to existing bicycle infrastructure in each of the cities. So if the cities didn't really have any existing bicycle infrastructure, which was the case for cities like Kyle, I showed on these maps where I would propose creating these connections so that riders could safely make it to and from the city centers. And so I have a map like this for each of the cities that the path passes through. And the map here shows the connection point in San Antonio, which is already an existing bicycle path that goes through the city that basically connects to downtown, and it makes like a 12-mile loop called the Breckenridge Trail. So overall, there would obviously need to be a lot more research around the funding options available for a project of this scale. And although there's like another big thing that came up in the case studies was using former railroad tracks to build builds of the bicycle highway along. And there was no viable option for that on this specific route. However, there is one just east of 35 in Austin. So if there was ever and it goes all the way up to like Georgetown and Round Rock. So if there ever was an extension of this bicycle path, it would probably make sense to use that as a connection and then use the existing rail facility that's there, tracks that are there. And I think I mentioned this, but we saw that in the Germany case study where they reused a bunch of that old track. And then finally, there would need to be more research done about the specific placement of on and off ramps. There's a bunch of research that's already been done about how that really adds to the cost. You have to be really careful about determining where to place on and off ramps. And of course, there would need to be intense regional coordination for this project to work. And that's everything I have. And I think Kate's next.
And
is Erasma back?
Nadia, yes. Kate will skip Kate. She just texted me privately. Yeah.
Okay. Let me see who's next. I think Elizabeth's next then.
Okay, give me 1 second to set up. Oops. Okay, can everybody see this?
Yep.
Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Elizabeth Altazan, and a big thank you to our viewers for being here today. This isn't really quite as exciting as the symposium that we wanted to host, but thank you for being here nonetheless. My research is on a planning methodology called Sustainable Urban Mobility Planning. And so for a little bit of background on my topic, going into the field study, I was initially really interested in observing European planning practices that tend to focus more on spatial planning and how those might be able to address some of the silos we have in US planning, particularly specific to transportation planning. So I'm really interested in affordable housing and environmental goals, and so I wanted to see how we could connect all of these plans into one. So lucky for me, we were able to see a presentation by a group called Ruprecht Consulting, and this consulting firm helps implement what's called Sustainable Urban Mobility Planning. It's an approach that was introduced by the European Commission in 2013. And it's a more modern, holistic approach to transportation planning. So my research studies the Sump, and then it looks at what implications it could have for planning in US megaregions, specifically looking at the Texas Triangle. So just as a disclaimer, Sump is a really, there's very detailed guidance. I'm gonna give a very high level overview because I have 6 minutes total to present. So what Sump is a step-by-step planning guidance. It's not theoretical, it's a very practical concept. The goal of Sump was to kind of move away from transportation planning that focuses on modes and traffic in order to create a more integrated system. It puts people at the center, and it really values cross-institutional collaboration and participation. Also, social and environmental factors are extremely important in the Sump methodology. Sump is based on 8 principles, which I won't read all of these to you, but you can see them there on your screen. But essentially, these principles reinforce its goals for collaboration, participation, continued learning, and measurable success. So evaluation is a very important component of a Sump. And this is what is called the Sump Cycle. Again, I won't read every single step, but this just gives you a picture of how detailed the guidance is. So there's 4 phases of Sump: initial planning, strategy development, measure planning, which is where you would choose interventions, and then implementation. There's 12 total steps, and each step has very specific subtasks. In addition to Sump, there's also what's called the PolySump. PolySump was created as additional guidance for regions who are interested in implementing a Sump. So Sump just adds elements into the existing framework. And specifically helpful, PolySump also offers supplemental tools. One is a regional profile. The regional profile is an online portal, and you can input like 10 different indicators of data from your region, and then it helps you better understand the interdependency within the megaregion. And this helps policymakers decide if they want to focus on inter-regional transport or intra. So kind of deciding if a focus on mobility within the nodes and cities would be a better approach, or between the nodes and cities would be a better approach. It also offers guidance for what they call a future search workshop. The workshop is kind of a condensed approach to the Sump planning, because PolySump realizes that when planning in a region, you're going to have a much, much broader field of stakeholders that need to be involved. And so instead of spanning the planning meetings over years and years, they kind of condense it into this one workshop that's really important for kind of goal setting for the Sump. And a few really quick case studies where Sump and PolySump have been especially successful. Manchester, England, which I think the CM2 group actually traveled to last year, as a city region in England. It's used Sump to create its transport strategy for 2040. So far, as a result of this, it's already implemented an integrated ticketing system where residents can buy tickets across all modes and operators on one app. Also in North Rhine, Germany, we actually were able to visit this region. North Rhine is a state in Germany that includes the Rhine-Ruhr megaregion. And this is a really interesting case study because they implemented a regional governance approach to implement Sump. So they have 4 regional offices that all hold mobility managers, and these managers provide support to the local jurisdictions in the state. So really big, the main goals or the main benefits of Sump for megaregion planning are the following. It offers a really clear starting point. It also helps reduce redundancy because it takes into account all existing plans. Sustainability goals is a really big benefit as our policies hopefully continue in the future to move towards valuing sustainability. It's customizable, and it would also give megaregion planning legitimacy because it offers a formal framework. So why Sump should be done first in the Texas Triangle? The biggest benefit is that the Texas Triangle falls within one state, so it should be a little bit easier to coordinate funding and collaboration. To get started with a Sump for the Texas Triangle, there's these kind of 5 key elements, which again, I won't read all of them to you, but basically Sump needs a legal framework and a financial framework in order to work. Also, it really needs a shared vision that includes shared metrics from the really early stages for it to be successful. And you may be wondering, how would a plan like this be scaled for such a giant region? And actually all of the steps of Sump are scalable at some level. So instead of offering like specific metrics that you should follow, it's more guidance of how you would pick these metrics. And so what I would suggest is that the first phase of Sump could be done at the local level and a partnership between MPOs and the major city. There's 4 major cities in the Texas Triangle. And then once that's done, once the kind of local planning framework and goals are assessed, a regional team should be created to develop the regional profile and the workshop. And so these are my initial recommendations for a successful Sump in the Texas Triangle. Ideally, we could pass federal legislation to enable NPOs to do this work and incentivize them. Though, as we're all familiar with transportation policy, this is not likely to happen anytime soon. So efforts could be started off between forming a relationship between the cities and the NPOs to kind of do the initial assessments. Again, phase 1 could be completed at that level. And even just doing that, I think, would be extremely beneficial for MSAs within the Texas Triangle. From there, the regional team could be created to develop the regional profile and complete the workshop. And the workshop would kind of set the measures and the metrics for Sump. And that's it. I think I went a little bit over time. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Okay, I think Jenny, I think you're next.
Hi, this is Jenny. Can you see the screen?
Yep.
Cool. So my research, first I need to make a clarification that instead of multiple case studies listed on a poster, I actually did a single case study of Texas Triangle in the interest of time. So my research is entitled as Does High-Speed Rail Enhance Transportation Equity in Mega Regions? And is a case study of Texas Triangle. So as you can see, this research focuses on the concept of transportation equity. So in the background, I did some research about the concept of the equity, which is the planner's ethics that we as planners should bear in mind. So equity, also called justice or fairness, refers to the fair and appropriate distribution of impact within the society. And there are a lot of aspects of social equity, such as the transportation, education, health, and job opportunities, etc. And this paper focus on the transportation aspect of the equity. So to look detail into the transportation equity, it refers to the fair and appropriate distribution and accessibility of transportation facilities to all people, regardless of the race, ethics, and socioeconomic status. So previously, there are multiple regional transportation plans that has the goal of the equity, such as the Trans-European Network for Transport, the famous 10T. And there are also regional there are also city vitality and sustainability for urban mobility. And these are 2 like transportation practices in Europe. And I included in my literature review to guide my research for the transportation equity in Texas. So my research question here is that with the definition of e.g. vulnerable counties in the context of Texas, the study asks the question of whether the implementation of high-speed rail would increase the mobility and accessibility in each vulnerable counties, and to what extent will this improvement happen? So this is a map about my study boundary, and I identified 11 MPOs within the Texas Triangle as the main employment attractions. So here's my methodology. I adopted 3 steps methodology. First is the definition of each vulnerable counties. And here I use the threshold approach to identify the non-white, the counties with non-white proportion above the average and the poverty rate above the average, and identify this as the EG vulnerable counties. So it's a binary variable. And in the second step, I measure the mobility and accessibility for each counties, and the mobility, where the mobility measures the average travel time of the city I to the other cities, and accessibility measures to what extent do people in region I are exposed to the economic opportunities in other cities. So here's my result. First, in the EG counties map, you can see that most EG vulnerable counties are located in the metropolitan areas like Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, and Harris. And also, there is a huge EG vulnerable counties cluster at the midline of Texas Triangle, which is this region. And the mobility map before and after shows that under the highway network, the midline of Texas Triangle has the best mobility, while after the implementation of the high-speed rail, the Dallas-San Antonio corridor will have an increase on the mobility based on the speed up. So the accessibility before and after high-speed rail shows that the 4 metropolitan areas, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, and Houston has the best accessibility before the high-speed rail. And after that, the same as the mobility, the corridor of Dallas and San Antonio will have an improvement in accessibility. And this table shows the comparison of non-EG vulnerable counties and EG vulnerable counties on mobility and accessibility before and after the high-speed rail. And you can see that for the EG vulnerable counties, the accessibility after high-speed rail has been multiplied based on the index of accessibility. And also, generally speaking, the EG vulnerable counties has better mobility and accessibility both before and after the implementation of high-speed rail. So based on the results, my conclusion is that in general, the implementation of high-speed rail can enhance transportation in Texas Triangle megaregion, and high-speed rail service will multiple the accessibility for some of the EG vulnerable counties. However, it's also identified that not every EG vulnerable counties have the same accessibility improvement after the implementation of the high-speed rail, especially for the midline of the Texas Triangle, where the accessibility is not increased that much as those in the metropolitan areas. So based on these findings, the further transportation policy could give advantage to the midline of the Texas Triangle, especially the rural region with the larger underrepresented groups for the transportation equity. There should be transportation policies that facilitate those regions to have a better accessibility. So this is all about my paper. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. I think Tatum's up next. Let me know if you have any trouble.
Is it working?
Yep.
Okay, I'm gonna try to zoom in here. Okay, so my project is focused on the viability of using public-private partnerships to develop transit-oriented parks in the Texas Triangle. This idea was inspired by our trip to the Netherlands and Germany because we visited a lot of different parks, and most of them were planned at a regional level. They were well connected by transit, even if they were outlying, and most of them had a high degree of private funding. So this project explores what this might look like in the Texas Triangle, because from other work that I've done, I've learned that Texas has a bit of a reputation for using public-private partnerships, although that's primarily for the highways and interstate systems. So to do this, I am considering transit-oriented parks as exactly what they sound like, parks that are oriented around transit stops as a means for giving something to do at the ends of transit lines. And I'm looking at this at the city level, but with the idea in mind that if localities are already doing this, there may be a potential for the Dallas to Houston high-speed rail to have parks oriented around their stops. So to do this, I looked at the master plans for all of the parks departments, transportation departments, and public transit agencies for 5 cities, which are Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, and San Antonio. When looking at their master plans, I looked for how they talked about regional cooperation, whether they mentioned the complementary agency, meaning whether the parks department mentioned their connection to transit and vice versa. And I looked at how reliant these different entities are on using private funding right now. Let's see, to gain a basis for the accessibility of parks and transportation systems in these 5 cities, I used data from the Trust for Public Lands and from WalkScore to essentially rank the cities on how accessible their parks are, their transit system is, and how walkable the city is. So the total scores for all of these would be out of 300 points, and that would mean like a very walkable and transit-driven city where you essentially don't need to use a car at all. And the highest performing city was Dallas, which only scored 141 points, which is essentially a 47%. So as these systems exist currently, they have a bit of trouble with access to their parks and transportation. So a brief overview of my findings. In terms of regional cooperation, I found that most parks departments only operated within their city limits and did not cooperate with suburban communities or any outlying areas. But transit departments and transportation departments really had an emphasis on regional cooperation, with most of them serving their suburban areas and outlying areas. A department that I wanted to highlight was San Antonio and their multimodal transportation plan, which was the only plan that really thoroughly discussed statewide rail as a necessity, and they also talked about placemaking at rail stations. They situated their plan within the context of the Lone Star Rail District, a Texas-Oklahoma rail system, and even the Dallas to Houston high-speed rail, and really promoted statewide rail as the future. In plan integration, I found that parks master plans really did focus a lot on the need to cooperate with transit agencies, and a lot of them did analyses of how accessible their parks were. But most transportation departments and transit agencies did not mention parks really at all, or see the need to incorporate them at their stops. A department I wanted to highlight here was Fort Worth and their Parks Master Plan, which was the only plan that explicitly tied parks at transit stops as a means for increasing ridership and really pushed for a connection between the 2 entities. And lastly, for private funding, I found that there was actually substantial reliance on using public-private partnerships, especially for parks departments. And transportation agencies actually saw a big increase in wanting to use this as they continue to see their funds from other sources decline. And the department that I want to highlight here is the Houston Parks Department, which used a public-private partnership to fund a really big system, the Bayou Greenways Trails, which was 150 miles of trails connecting 3,000 acres of parks, and repurposing old rail lines like Nadia mentioned in her presentation. And these trails are very accessible by public transit. And in the pictures here, you can see the one in the middle is one of the parks that is connected by this trail system in Houston. And the one on the right is a park in Dallas that is considered transit-oriented. Lastly, I did a very, very basic GIS overview to see how well transportation systems lined up with park systems in these cities, except for San Antonio, who I could not get availability of a shapefile for their bus stops. And as you can see, many of the largest parks in these cities are not served by any transit. So there is definitely still a disconnect. If I were researching this further, I would want to pay more attention to the equity implications of leveraging private funding to this degree, because that was something that we heard about in both the Netherlands and Germany, was that their reliance on private funding did cause some equity issues. But overall, I think that the Texas Triangle cities do have a lot of potential for using their departments in a more integrated way to build transit-oriented parks as a new means of sustainability.
Thanks, Tatum. So next I have Paul.
All right. Should I just start sharing right now?
Yeah, go for it.
Cool. All right. So this kind of connects to what Tatum was just talking about. So we're going to be talking about policies and practices for regionally coordinated brownfield development in the Texas Triangle megaregion. So just a bit of background. There's obviously thousands of brownfield sites across the United States. and their revitalization is kind of very important to nearby residents who are, impacted by the effects of contamination on site and kind of the degradation of nearby properties, and can be negatively or positively impacted their reuse depending on kind of the program that is on the new space and its intended audiences. And so we visited some successful investment in brownfield development in the rural region as part of the Shear Landscape Park initiative. It was kind of a very large development of some old industrial sites kind of spread across the northern Westphalia region of Germany. And so just some initial research questions I had is, what is the current framework for brownfield development in the United States? How are efforts coordinated between jurisdictions? How do current policies impact the execution of projects on the ground? And how does this compare to the practices that we witnessed in Germany? And so I'm gonna go into two case studies. One from the Houston area that Tatum was just talking about at Buffalo Bayou Park with their new trail system, and then back at the Shear Landscape Park. And then just to I'm gonna focus on one specific project in Dortmund of the Shear Landscape Park, just to keep the scale comparison in mind. And then, as I was just talking about before, literature review revealed that there have been some instances of concerns over equity with the use of private incentives in brownfield development, which can kind of target the most kind of marketable sites instead of the ones in the greatest need. And there can be kind of some difficulty with coordinating, even just on agreeing in the same definition of what constitutes a brownfield. And so with that, I'm gonna kind of bring you into the context of brownfield development in Texas. So here's a very roughly made map of kind of brownfield sites tracked by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And they kind of spearhead all brownfield kind of policies and programs for the state of Texas. So they kind of run these voluntary cleanup program, which is the largest brownfield program in the state of Texas. And it kind of provides technical, legal support to encourage cleanup of contaminated sites across the state. And then the Brownfield Site Assessment Program, where they conduct phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments for government agencies and nonprofits looking to redevelop brownfield sites. And then the Superfund in Texas, which I'm sure you guys have heard of, the Superfund federal policy. And this is kind of a supplement to that in the state of Texas. And with that, I'm gonna briefly go over these two case studies. So I'll start with the one in Houston, the Buffalo Bayou Park. And so I'm gonna go over their organization, funding source, public participation methods, and then kind of briefly the outcomes for both of these case studies, so we can kind of compare on those categories. So as Tatum was just talking about, obviously Buffalo Bayou Park was a part of a public-private partnership that involved a nonprofit development corporation called the Buffalo Bayou Partnership, which was given kind of stewardship over a 10-mile tract along the bayou by the Harris County Flood Control District and the city of Houston. And on funding sources, so they did receive the city of Houston received a large grant from the Environmental Protection Agency for remediation purposes. And then they also received a transportation grant from the federal government for the creation of that multimodal trail that Tatum was talking about. And then they used a patchwork of TERS districts, tax increment reinvestment zones, as kind of a local source, local incentive for development in the area. And then for public participation, it kind of was mostly just about informing the public of the plan and what was going on. It wasn't quite so involved. They were kind of sending out bilingual postcards and social media posts to let people know, but they weren't quite involved kind of in the planning processes. And some initial outcomes, obviously this is still taking place with the Eastern Master Plan coming out last year. But so far, we've actually seen some gentrification as a result of some of these reinvestments in these communities. Actually, 2 of the zip codes are considered among the nation's top 20 in terms of gentrification between 2000 and 2016. So that's kind of raised some concerns over equity and the use of these tourist districts to finance the reinvestment. And then how does this compare to what we saw in Germany? So this is the Phoenix East and Phoenix West redevelopment of what was a steel factory in Dortmund, Germany. So obviously you see Phoenix East over here and West, and this is a new lake that they made, it's a man-made lake, which is pretty interesting. And so it actually followed a pretty similar organizational strategy with a public-private partnership for each of the 2 development sites, with 2 different nonprofit development corporations created to oversee the development of each site. And then they actually did kind of a similar funding sources as well, where you had kind of local incentives matched with these kind of, well, they were from the EU, not from the federal state of Germany, but EU grants as well. And those grants actually did come with some limitations that kind of scaled back some of the plan's kind of goals that they had on the onset, which I thought was really interesting because I came into it expecting kind of smooth partnership at all levels, and that's not really what I saw when I dug deeper in. And they were actually forced to not build any planned social housing, which is what they call affordable housing in Germany, because of some of the stipulations with the EU grants, which I thought was really interesting. And then their public participation was more robust than what we saw in the Houston context, where they actually held kind of open competitions to bring in design ideas for the residential construction, which I thought was really interesting and moves further into kind of citizen control fields. And then outcomes, obviously this resulted in a large $220 million investment in this kind of new mixed use area. It's really become kind of a large part of this kind of new Dortmund that has emerged. And then, apologies for the small map, but this is how this M shear, this darker green here, is how it connects to this larger scheme that kind of goes over 20 different municipalities, and as a kind of a hike and bike continuous trail and kind of green open space. So kind of a new kind of regional spot in Dortmund.
Dortmund. It's called Phoenix East.
Cool, thanks, Paul. So I think last we have Michelle. Last but not least, Michelle.
Okay, cool. Okay. So my project looked at regional flood mitigation practices in the Netherlands and Texas. So a little bit of background. Basically, as we all know, climate change and rapid urbanization are posing significant challenges to planners and policymakers. And these have increased the frequency and severity of storms all over the world. And so basically my research looks at different flood risk management strategies in the Netherlands and Texas, and I'm focusing on the Rhine Delta and the Houston-Galveston region. When we were in the Netherlands, we visited a few different Room for the River projects, which I'll talk a little bit more. And so my research questions were essentially, what are the different flood risk management strategies? How do governance structures shape and impact these different strategies? And then how can flood risk management provide an opportunity to achieve broader planning objectives? And what lessons can Texas learn from the Netherlands, essentially? So I'll talk a little bit about the Rhine Delta region. So basically half of the Netherlands is at or below sea level, and they've been dealing with flooding for the last many centuries. Implemented in the past a lot of different structural projects that try to control water. But more recently, they've decided that it's more efficient to give space to the river. They can't control the water forever. And so they implemented the Room for the River program, which was a pretty massive regional project that comprised 34 different measures and had a cost of 2.3 billion euros, and it was funded by the central government. The project had the dual objective of flood defense and improving spatial quality. So basically, the national government worked with the different provinces, municipalities, and water districts, as well as different local residents and businesses that would be displaced throughout this project. And essentially, they developed unique solutions for each of these different projects by working with the communities and the municipalities, identifying different goals that these areas wanted to achieve. And so then a little brief overview of the Houston-Galveston region. So again, as we all know, this region is extremely susceptible to flooding, and most recently, Hurricane Harvey brought unprecedented flooding to the region. There have been a lot of studies done on the amount of structures that were flooded, and a lot of this recovery is still happening today. So one of the big mitigation strategies that I focused on in my research is floodplain buyouts, because they most effectively eliminate flood risk. And however, the problem is that floodplain buyouts are pretty complicated, and they're also a pretty timely process. So funding is essentially provided by FEMA, but different counties or municipalities have to match part of the funding. And a lot of the buyout processes start after the disaster is hit. So this really kind of prevents a lot of people from partaking in the buyout programs, because they essentially want to start rebuilding their homes as soon as the flooding is over. And so buyouts have a lot of potential, but there are certain challenges associated with them. And so basically, in looking at the comparison between the two different regions, I wanted to highlight some things that Texas can potentially learn from the projects that were implemented in the Netherlands. So the Dutch basically have really focused on kind of large-scale coordinated projects that, again, were kind of initiated by the central government, but really involved all of the different stakeholders. So again, the different municipalities and regions, but also the central government has provided the funding for it. So that's really important. In Texas, there have been a lot of smaller scale disjointed projects. Floodplain buyouts are pretty piecemeal and usually have not really been planned out to a large scale. And then the next finding essentially is about governance. So the Netherlands really focused on multi-level governance. And again, this collaboration, I think, made it a lot more of a process that was able to achieve different goals, and also prevented stakeholders, I guess, from pushing back on the project. And then in Texas, the governance is pretty much handled by a single entity. So buyouts are often done at the county level, and there's really no participation with stakeholders. And the last thing is looking at integrated management in the Netherlands. So again, using these flood risk mitigation projects to achieve different spatial planning goals. So again, a lot of the different measures involved using this new open space to improve the area for residents, including building parks and bike networks. And again, in Texas, there's a pretty narrow focus on just mitigation. So once buyouts happen, they kind of just become open space. And there's not too much thought about the long-term purpose of acquired land. So, I mean, as Paul and Tatum had just kind of talked about, the Buffalo Biopark seems like a really good example to reach for, I guess. But there's still so many areas in the region that have been flooded. And so basically if Houston is able to complete more buyouts, there's a lot of potential with the open space. And yeah, there's potential to develop new parks and bike networks and other things, other amenities for the public. So yeah, that's pretty much it for me.
Cool, thanks, Michelle. All right, looks like we have some time left now for Q&A. So I don't know if we want to go by each reviewer. Does anyone feel ready or have a question they want to ask? All right, what about you, Sandy? Do you have any questions?
Let me ask Josiah, I'm not exactly sure what you were doing. You started off by talking about how regions in Europe, people have a regional identity, they feel a citizen of a region, and then you started talking about the regional plans of various MPOs. And so I'm not sure what your actual goal was, and do you envision that citizens would feel like they're a mega region citizen, or if they only felt like they were a citizen of the San Antonio region, is that the same thing as you saw in Europe?
Yeah. So yeah, just to start with the first question. Crap, now I forgot what the exact, can you repeat the first part of the question again?
The first part, you started by talking about how you felt that citizens of a region in Europe felt themselves to be regional citizens. I think you said they identify in that way. and then you came back and looked at what MPOs do in Texas, and the link for me is not very clear.
Yeah, for sure. And so what my reasoning there is, where it stems from, is that I think with a lot of the regions, with the regions we saw in Europe, they all had some sort of a shared history, whether it was like economic, political. They had something that bound them together. And when I started to look at how cities in the Texas Triangle started to define themselves and to identify, there's just not much of anything shared there besides the fact that they reside within this like geospatial, like this geography. So then instead of trying to force something that's not there, I wanted to look for other avenues to start to develop some sort of some sort of recognition of this larger mega regional body. And so that's why I made the transition to looking at MPOs, because a lot of their work spans boundaries and they have to collaborate with other regions. That it was there that I thought I could start to explore where there might be some room for overlap, and room for some smaller scale cooperation that could end up leading and guiding the development of a larger mega regional identity. Does that make sense?
Not really, but do the regional governments in Germany and the Netherlands, do they do only planning, or do they actually provide services?
So like the IBA,
The MPOs provide very few services.
Yeah, it was, from what I understood, it was mostly just planning, and someone else can chip in if they are more familiar with the regional governance structures there. But
so your premise is that these regional governments in Europe, even though they do only planning, there's a sort of inherent legitimacy to planning at the regional scale because people somehow feel close to those regional governments. And you're trying to find a way to replicate that model.
On some level, yes.
Josiah, I couldn't exactly follow your charts, and I know you really didn't have time to unpack them, but it seemed to me from your charts that the kind of central concerns of MPOs are sort of what you would expect: system efficiency, safety, et cetera. So to the extent that those are the priorities of the MPOs, why wouldn't those be the most promising terrains for sort of inter-MPO collaboration? Those are pretty quotidian things, right? Oh, well, Dallas and Austin will talk about how to deal with, system efficiency improvements on I-35 or, whatever. So it seems like those priorities of the individual MPOs would, more readily sort of communicate possibilities for inter-MPO collaboration.
So you think instead of reading past those are signs for potential? I guess what I was looking for was more, I was hoping to find more like appetite for, say, regional connectivity or regional mobility that would be directly applicable to, say, things like